It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Jean-Francois Caron, who is our C. Judson King Distinguished Visiting Professor in 2025-26. And he also kindly agreed to serve as interim chair of the MPA and MAIRD upon his arrival. Professor Caron earned his PhD at the Université Laval in Canada, Quebec. He is a specialist of just war theory, military ethics, social contract, multiculturalism, nationalism, and a few other topics. He has been teaching for many years at the Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan, where he has served as chair of the Department of Political Science from 2017 to 2020. It would take too much time to read his CV, but as I like concision, I should say that Professor Caron is a heavy lifter. He is the author of I don't know how many books. Putin's War and the Reopening of History, Springer 2023, then Herman in France 2024, Université Laval 2024, Fear and the COVID-19 Pandemic, Liberticidal Virus, Routledge 2023, The Moral Dilemma of Fighting Terrorism, the Grutter 2023, and the list goes on up to the middle of the next page, so you got the idea. He doesn't seem to have much to do in life, so he writes things, and that makes him happy, which is good. He's not harming anybody. That's good. So today he will be talking about understanding Vladimir Putin's social contract. If you haven't read the summary not the summary, but really the short synopsis of the talk, this is the whole problem of whether, in the very authoritarian regimes, there is such a thing as a social contract going on, or whether the ruler can just do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, because there is the massive repressive apparatus, to crush the population. So we really look forward to listening to Professor Caron's analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Before I begin, let me just say that the opinions or perspectives that I will share with you today are solely mine and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of the American University of Armenia. And what I will be presenting you today is a small part of a much broader discussion about the authoritarian social contract, the reasons why it is currently on the rise, and why the democratic one has been facing a setback since the last 20 years. And this project will be published next year. So there's a lot of misunderstanding when we're talking about authoritarian states. Jails, repression, torture, murders, people being constantly scared. And this is probably the image most of people have in mind. But authoritarianism is a far more complex reality. Repression is undoubtedly a reality of these regimes, but not necessarily synonymous of people being denied their personal freedom. In fact, as the Prince de Talleyrand once said, you can do many things with bayonets, but you simply cannot sit on them, meaning that violence cannot be a long-term solution. And a metaphor echoed by his emperor Napoleon, who said that terrorist methods are a sign of weakness rather than a sign of strength. So a long-lasting authoritarian regime will only be possible when people are becoming able to feel a genuine sense of support and legitimacy for those who are ruling them. but the whole question is how this support and legitimacy can be created. So in other words, what are the foundations of the authoritarian social contract? So as you know, the social contract is probably one of the oldest concepts in political theory. While it has been widely discussed during the long Enlightenment century by some of the most influential philosophers of Western tradition, namely Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, or Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the fact remains that Socrates and Plato already talked about the reasons that ought to justify the submission of people to their political authority. All these individuals did not share the same opinion about the deep reasons for this popular difference, and similarly to them, I am certain that my definition of the social contract will not be agreed upon by everyone. I'm of course fully aware that it would be overly presumptuous to compare myself to all these great minds that have left a long-lasting impact on the way we think about people and society by trying to match their theories by advocating for the deep reasons, the moral reasons that ought to explain the reasons individuals should dedicate themselves to a higher authority that will in return impose on them obligations and limit their personal freedom. My view is different. Instead of, like Machiavelli, instead of overestimating what individuals truly wish for, and by looking at them the way they should behave as citizens, I believe it's more useful to analyze how they empirically behave to figure out what their most basic desires and expectations are. And at the risk of shocking some of you, these expectations are firmly down to earth and are not aiming for the satisfaction of superior moral ideals. For sure, many will call this vision reductive due to its business-like resemblance to typical working contracts that call upon people to submit themselves to state authority, insofar as this authority can provide individuals with the expected benefits they're hoping to receive. What will link people to a superior authority and lead them to recognize its legitimacy will depend upon their rational calculation that will drive their answer to the following question. Is the current dynamic between myself and those ruling the state is allowing me to fulfill my needs as an individual? And accordingly, the legitimacy of the social contract will be correlated to the satisfaction of purely utilitarian output. Individuals will therefore display a sense of loyalty and obedience towards those who are in charge of ruling them, as long as the latter's decisions allow the former to satisfy their expectations. And in return, when statesmen are failing at this task, they inevitably tend to lose their credibility in the eyes of their citizens, who will start questioning the raison d'être of their submission. So with this in mind, I am defining the social contract as an implicit agreement between members of a society and their state, conceived as a form of trade-off, where the legitimacy of the latter in submission to authority will depend upon the provision and satisfaction of certain benefits to the former. But this begs the following questions. What are these needs that are so pivotal to any social contract? The most basic benefits all citizens around the world are expecting to receive from their society are the following. 1. Personal safety, that is the capacity to experience a constant feeling of security and of being able to enjoy life without the fear of losing it. Secondly, the enjoyment of personal freedom, that is our ability to enjoy the capacity to pursue personal actions without having to face interferences from others or agents of the state. And third one, the satisfaction of material well-being, which refers to having the capacity to enjoy wealth and resources in a sufficient amount to support one's life and the one of those we are responsible for. It also refers to having the perception that our living conditions will always be improving, more precisely by having the perception that we have a better material life than our parents and that our children will have a better one than ours. These are the core foundations of Vladimir Putin's social contract. So following the collapse of USSR, the hope that democracy could become a reality in Russia was very high. However, it rapidly evaporated following Vladimir Putin's arrival to power on December 31st, 1999, and his gradual transformation of Russia into an authoritarian state, which is now said by many to bear more and more similarities with the worst period of Soviet Union, when it was led by Stalin due to its expansionist views and harsh repressive methods against opponents. Inevitably, this narrative on the similarities between Putin and Stalin is forcing us to wonder whether this comparison is appropriate or rather an exaggerated image. As I wish to argue today, Putin's social contract does indeed share a lot of similarities with the Soviet one, although with the one that was implemented following Stalin's death. So unlike the Stalinian contract that relied heavily on coercive control over all aspects of society, including people's private sphere, the one that was implemented under Khrushchev's had more to do with the typical authoritarian contract than with the totalitarian one. Rather than using a totalitarian ideology to compel individuals, a possibility that had been seriously hindered following Khrushchev's speech at the 20th Party Congress in 1956, popular support for the post-Stalin Soviet regime found its foundations in the provision of various benefits to the people, namely social mobility, secured employment, state-controlled prices for essential goods, and higher wages. The trade-off people had to accept was their absence of political freedom in exchange for these benefits. So it's important to understand that the post-Stalin social contract, because it bears a lot of similarities with the one in Russia since 2000, namely for two reasons. First, for having copied it until the financial crisis of 2008, and second, for facing the same challenges it encountered during the 1980s. A challenge that begs the question whether Vladimir Putin will be more successful than Mikhail Gorbachev in changing it. So Stalin's death and the following de-Stalinization process that followed 3 years later forced his successors to rethink the foundations of the regime's stability, which could no longer depend upon an ideology that they had just so severely criticized. They therefore chose to move from utopia to pragmatism, meaning that the new basis of the Soviet social contract would henceforward depend upon its ability to deliver various benefits to the Soviet people. So understanding that getting access to important political positions would always remain the prerogative of a few, the regime understood that the establishment of a populist social contract was the only other way at its disposal to generate a sense of legitimacy that would induce the people to support the regime. Khrushchev's solution was therefore to prioritize the improvement of people's quality of life. This commitment was made explicit by Soviet leaders as it was codified in official documents, such as during the 22nd Congress of the Communist Party of November 1961, during which the Politburo declared improvements of social welfare and increases in distributive equality to be central goals of party politics and promised Soviet society large, long-term increases in levels of income and social security. From that point on, the regime's domestic goal was no longer the promotion of communism, but rather to provide its people with living standards superior to those of capitalist societies. But this system came with a huge cost. This populist social contract led to a massive increase in social expenditures that rose from 27 billion rubles in 1960 to 117 in 1980, which represented a rise of annual per capita social expenses of 128 rubles in 1960, all the way to 438 in 1980. And inevitably, the soaring cost of maintaining this social contract, as well as its inherent logic, led to many concerns. Among them was the belief that this system was hindering economic growth and productivity because of the excessive cost of its social guarantees. The policy that consisted in offering a full-time job to all able-bodied citizens also condemned the Soviet economy to technological stagnation and its inability to shift towards a post-industrial system. Furthermore, this system ended up fostering laziness and a lack of professionalism amongst workers because of their job security and other policies that made their firing, apart from political dissidents, virtually impossible. At the end of Konstantin Chernenko's reign, practically every worker fired for alcoholism and other breaches of labor discipline could easily find a job someplace else, and of all those fired for a breach of discipline on the job, 30% not only immediately found a new job, but also received an increase in salary of 30%. From the 1960s until the end of the 1970s, the state-society trade-off was able to deliver its expectations. Citizens saw a constant improvement in their material lives, who in return remained politically passive. However, because the overall objective of the Soviet regime was not the constant improvement of the country's economic performance, but rather its desire to buy public support, its economic models stagnated at the end of Brezhnev's era. Instead of perceiving the long-term problems of its social contract, the Kremlin was blinded by the hubris of the short-term outcomes of its trade-off with its citizens. Brezhnev's decision to carry on with the post-Stalin contract, regardless of the consequences, meant that it soon faced its sudden inability to deliver the expected goods the Soviet people had been accustomed to. And inevitably, the inherent problem of the post-Stalin social contract, that is, maintaining economic growth through a system that was not encouraging performance and innovation, meant a steady decline of the country's economic growth, making it impossible to maintain its populist system of redistribution. However, because it had developed a strong feeling of people's entitlement and drastically eroded any incentive to sacrifice oneself for a superior ideal, in this case communism, it made its reform impossible, as we now know, and USSR collapsed primarily because of the ineffectiveness of its economic model that could only lead to the erosion of its social contract. So following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia willfully and enthusiastically embraced economic and political liberalism under the reign of its first president, Boris Yeltsin, through its well-known shock therapy, aimed at moving quickly from a previous centrally planned economy to a market-based system that was promised to raise Russian standards of living following what was promised to be a difficult but short period of adjustment. The strategy ended up being a catastrophe for the country. From 1992 to 1999, unemployment, which had been an inexistent reality in the USSR, steadily rose to nearly 15%, while many workers were left unpaid. Furthermore, Russia's gross domestic product declined by 40% during the 1990s, industrial production contracted by 50% from 1992 to 1996, Russia's economy defaulted in 1998 on ruble-denominated bonds, hyperinflation disseminated the Russian people's savings, retail prices of basic goods skyrocketed, and the previous Soviet safety net that guaranteed access to healthcare was completely shattered. As it comes to criminality, more Russians died of criminal violence in 1993 than the overall number of Russian soldiers who died during the entire war in Afghanistan, while male life expectancy decreased by 6 years between 1991 and 1994. What resulted was the pauperization of an overwhelming majority of Russian people and the enrichment of oligarchs who had taken advantage of their connections to acquire state property below market price. It became Vladimir Putin's goal to stop the Yeltsin system. How? By reintroducing the post-Stalin social contract. By appointing close allies, the Siloviki, as heads of key companies, Putin made sure they would now operate solely for the sake of Russia and its people, mainly by nationalizing key and strategic economic sectors to allow the state to have greater control over the redistribution of benefits by controlling the dividends instead of letting them in the hands of the private sector. In a certain way, Putin's goal was to reintroduce a Soviet-type social contract that would focus on the allocation of benefits rather than economic efficiency in return for political passivity. Based on the fact that most political protests result from social and economic grievances, Putin emphasized from his first days in office the need to focus on people's material well-being. Social programs that were cut in the 1990s were reintroduced, pensions were not only paid, but also indexed. Furthermore, the implementations of legislations made it difficult for employers to dismiss employees, and a system was implemented in order to shield industrial workers employed in single industry monotowns from market competitions. In the latter case, this protection was deemed fundamental by the Russian government out of fear that these workers were more susceptible to generate social unrest. A legacy of the Soviet Union, these monotowns had been ways for the state to exploit the country's vast geography by placing production where the raw materials were, meaning that in many of these towns, everybody is employed at the same plant, thereby making them ticking political time bombs in the advent of an economic crisis or a sharp decline in demand for raw materials. In many cases, these enterprises are not even profitable, like the plant that produces Lada vehicles. Yet, this does not prevent the fact that the city of Toliati, where the plant is located, registered in 2013 what was presented as the lowest unemployment rate in Russia, 0.6%. So the persistence of state subsidies to this sector of the economy, which was estimated by the World Bank to reach 7% of Russia's federal budget in 2010, can therefore be explained by the regime's unwillingness to face protest from people who would then blame the regime for not providing them with their basic material needs. The Kremlin also paid attention to other key groups susceptible to initiate protest, especially pensioners, who represent a significant portion of the voters. In 2005, the Russian government had to backpedal on its plan to implement social reforms that would have replaced many of the benefits inherited from Soviet Union pensioners were receiving, like free public transport and reduced energy bills, in return for cash handouts, after thousands of them began rallying in dozens of cities, blocked roads, and even in some cases hijacked buses, on top of asking for Putin's resignation and calling for nothing less than a revolution. Faced by these protests and seeing his popularity declining, Putin was forced to admit that his government had mismanaged the reform and announced an increase in people's pensions and the reintroduction of their former benefits. Even though Putin's social contract had a greater emphasis on increasing the benefits of certain social groups, it nonetheless remains that it has been, for the most part, a populist one that has largely benefited the entire Russian population, which has enjoyed steadily improving living standards. In times of crisis, such as in 2008, the government did not hesitate to use its massive reserves to minimize the impacts on the Russian people by providing money to industries and companies to prevent a sharp rise in unemployment in the country. Putin has also successfully met people's need for safety, something Yeltsin had not been able to provide. Indeed, between 1987 and 1993, the number of homicides rose by 246% and robberies with violence by 592%. From 2002 to 2021, the crime rate per 100,000 inhabitants went down from 30 to 6.8, while the homicide rate went from 30 per 100,000 inhabitants in 2002 to 7 in 2021. So with these improvements, people's concerns for crime has consequently dramatically declined over the last 25 years, as demonstrated by the numerous surveys completed by the Levada Center. To the question, which of the following issues in our society worries you the most and which are the most severe, the rise in crime rate reached a level of 53% in 2000 before declining to 9% in 2020. However, as it is the case with any other populist social contract, it remains vulnerable to external contingencies that can hinder its ability to provide people's expected goods, such as an economic crisis, falling gas prices, or economic sanctions. When it is the case, political support and perceived legitimacy for the rulers tend to erode. Indeed, starting from the financial crisis, popular support for Putin as well as a positive assessment of the situation in the country began to steadily decrease. More precisely, from 88% in September 2008, Putin's support had come down to 61% in November 2013, while the positive assessment of the Russian situation went from 64% in December 2007 to 40% in December 2013. Regarding the latter indicator, the percentage of Russians who felt like their country was going in the wrong direction was at some point higher than that of those who felt otherwise. These signs were indicative of the country's inability to maintain the previous benefits to its people, despite its effort to minimize as much as it could the impact of the crisis. More precisely, the 2008 financial crisis had been followed by a decrease in the quality of many public services, such as healthcare and education. In other words, the effect of the crisis were simply stronger than its remedies. With the collapse of oil prices, Russia's economy was hit very hard and ended up facing a situation similar to the one it was confronted with in the early 1980s when the same situation happened. If Russia had been able to enjoy an economic growth averaging 7% from 1999 to 2008, it had only averaged 1% from 2009 until 2020. This meant that continuing with policies associated with the populist social contract was no longer possible, especially since Russia's economic growth never came back to its pre-2008 pattern, and the government had been experiencing difficulties in balancing its budget, a problem it had never faced since Putin's arrival in power. A new approach to state-citizens relationship had to be found. As I have said before, one of the main reasons for the collapse of the Brezhnev populist social contract was the high level of entitlement it created on the part of the Soviet citizens, who were no longer bound by the need to make collective sacrifices. Instead, whenever the occasion presented itself in the 1980s, they either mobilized to prevent changes to the delivery of benefits or to take a corporate disadvantage of the proposed reforms. And this is the reason why such authoritarian contract is inherently shallow and fragile, because of its inability to mobilize individuals. This is why one key component of Putin's post-2008 social contract seems to have been his attempt at reviving a form of ideological legitimacy in support of his decisions, something that had been missing in the USSR since the de-Stalinization process of 1956. And this ideological support has come in the form of a revival of the 19th century Slavophile legacy that has always played a significant role in the collective psyche of the Russian people. I won't enter into details about this, as it would require another lecture, but for those who are interested in knowing more about it, I'm recommending you this book I've published in 2023. But very briefly, this idea of Russia's exceptionalism became a central part of Putin's rhetoric starting in 2011, which represented a major shift from the views he previously had about the West. And this can be highlighted through numerous policies and speeches in which the world of international relations started to be presented increasingly as a clash between different civilizations, and Russia's right as a unique civilization to remain a culturally distinctive nation in power. In this regard, we can mention the restrictions imposed on the LGBT community, as well as Putin's 2013 address to the Federation Council, in which he criticized the nihilism of the West that he deemed unable to distinguish between good and evil, while Russia was, for its part, faithful to its cultural values. As the mirror of the Western world, Putin's civilizational vision was presented as an openly conservative shield aimed at preventing the erosion of traditional values. In this regard, the annual Valdai Discussion Club meetings have certainly been Putin's preferred moments during which he has expressed the new divide of the international world. The remnants of this theme that was so dear to the Slavophiles have also been present following Putin's return to power, especially the idea of Russia acting as a moral lighthouse and a shield against decadent forces, which summarizes the thesis of Moscow being the third Rome. And this idea is attached to the notion of personal sacrifice to save humanity, which has historically been presented as a quintessential Russian virtue. Whether we consider the 13th century, during which the Rus were able to force the Mongols to retreat eastward, when the Russian army defeated Napoleon in the 19th century, when it prevented the Balkans from falling into the hands of the Ottomans, or the 1941-1945 Great Patriotic War, the idea of being a shield at the service of preserving mankind from decay and destruction has been and remains an important part of the Russian psyche. Maybe this shift was sincere on his part, but we cannot exclude the possibility that, in light of the inability to maintain his previous populist social contract, it had become a necessity to justify the decrease in people's material well-being for the sake of a sacred war. In other words, with the inability of the former contract to continue generating passive and instrumental loyalty on the part of people, Putin might have felt the need to reintroduce in the popular political psyche the ideal of sacrifice for the sake of a higher collective end as a counterweight to people's deception. After a decade of loans that have allowed people to increase their material well-being, the state is now calling in the debt. So in a way, Putin has operated the following shift. Until 2008, his social contract was a populist one and focused on granting his people their expected benefits, in this case, largely material well-being and safety. However, after a financial crisis, another component was added to it, namely an ideological component that was not estranged from the Russian collective psychology. This had transformed Russia from a conventional authoritarian state into a semi-hybrid form of totalitarianism, when totalitarianism is understood the same way as Ralph Dahrendorf, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and Karl Friedrich did, that is, when a state is seeking to mobilize its people through the use of some form of coherent set of ideological beliefs. However, Putin's war in Ukraine can make us wonder about the actual effect of this ideological attempt to legitimize his rule on his otherwise rather conventional type of authoritarian social contract. The way Putin's regime has been managing its war in Ukraine must lead us to be skeptical about the real impacts of the ideological support he has been trying to push for the past 15 years. On the contrary, the Kremlin's war strategy in Ukraine has instead been organized exclusively around the parameters of the classical authoritarian social contract that is deprived of any ideological support. More precisely, the Russian strategy has indeed exclusively focused on attracting volunteers into its armed forces. Doing otherwise would have been committing the same mistake as the Soviet Union did during its war in Afghanistan, when many ideologically indifferent men were sent against their will to risk their lives in a war many disagreed with. Instead, Putin chose to attract volunteers by granting them very generous signing bonuses that represent multiple times the average wages in their region, a sign that the level of patriotism of young Russian men may be low or insufficient for taking risks for their lives. And this has played a large role in Russia's planning since its failed offensive in February 2022. It is why it has largely used mercenaries of the Wagner Group, inmates who were freed in return for serving in the armed forces, but also foreign soldiers, such as those from North Korea who fought in the Kursk region. It is also explaining why Russia has not launched major counteroffensives similar to those of the Soviet period during 1941-1945 that would entail important losses as well as their possible failure, losses Russia that would be too expensive for Moscow from a financial point of view. More precisely, the cost of salaries given to soldiers is estimated to cost around 21.5 million USD per day, including one-time enlistment bonuses, to which must be added the bonuses paid to the families of deceased soldiers and those who have been injured. These efforts have come with a huge price to the country's sovereign fund, which has taken a hit since 2022. But this strategy has also led to the development of another problem for Putin's social contract, which had to become corporatist. The war has indeed produced a class of individuals whose increased standards of living depend upon the continuation of the government investing so massively in its military-industrial complex. This includes those who have volunteered to fight in Ukraine, as well as their family, but also workers in key sectors who have seen their salary increase up to a third in the Kurgan region, where armored personal vehicles are built, because of a shortage of available employees. A situation that resulted from the state's massive direct spending in the economy, and especially those from the defense sector that now account for an astonishing 40% of total expenditures. Indeed, because of the financial perks they have been provided with, surveys from the Levada centers have shown that a significant number of Russians believe that their living standards have increased since 2022. For the millions of Russians who are directly or indirectly benefiting from the increased wages, an end to the war may prove to be a dangerous prospect for the Kremlin, which needs to take into consideration how they will react when their wealth suddenly comes to a standstill. To avoid their reaction, the Kremlin is in a way condemned to keep things as they are, at the risk of creating a rupture of the social contract by deceiving them, because their positive attitude towards war does not seem to be motivated at all by some sort of ideological consideration. However, the pursuit of this trend may also end up amplifying other problems that have resulted from the war. Indeed, the huge cost of the war effort has led the Kremlin to make savings elsewhere by cutting some social programs and non-military related investment, while at the same time increasing taxes for certain categories of people. So as a result, if some individuals have benefited from the conflict, others have not, such as public sector workers and pensioners whose revenues have not increased due to the war and who are now forced to sustain the cost of inflation, thereby leading to a situation of growing economic disparities between those benefiting from the war and those who are not, a situation that could potentially lead to civic unrest in the future. So in conclusion, Vladimir Putin's approach to the social contract must therefore be understood in light of two separate time periods. Firstly, the one he implemented after his election to the Kremlin in 2000 showed many similarities with the post-1953 social contract, which focused on the delivery of benefits to the people. This desire explains in large part his attack against the oligarchs who had saved Yeltsin's bid for re-election to the presidency in 1996 and who helped his successor to rise to power. The implementation of his first social contract required him to change Yeltsin's dynamic with the economic sphere by subordinating it entirely to the state authority. In terms of political popularity and stability, this contract proved itself to be largely successful. However, the Soviet example also showed how such a populist contract is simply not sustainable in the long run, as its survival is too contingent on external factors the regime simply cannot control. This is why after the 2008 financial crisis, Putin had no choice but to move in another direction. While he did not abandon the logic of the previous social contract by keeping it as a trade-off between certain interdictions in exchange for benefits, it has rather become associated more and more with an ideological component which aim is to outweigh the negative aspect of the populist contract that tends to create a sense of entitlement that is inimical to collective sacrifices. In a way, similarly to Middle Eastern and Northern African countries that have been able to survive the popular unrest of 2018 because of the presence of a type of charismatic legitimacy that was able to outweigh people's grievances, Putin appears to be pursuing a similar path by creating a form of ideological legitimacy in the hope that it could manage to mobilize individuals for other reasons than the purely utilitarian ones associated with the conventional populist social contract at a time when the trade-off is becoming less and less beneficial to people. In other words, he has tried to implement a rally around the flag mentality based upon Russia's civilizational legacy in opposition to the West through a us and them divide that is typical of totalitarian regimes. However, in light of Russian man's attitude following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, there are reasons to doubt that this ideological component has genuine repercussions. After an almost long decade of loyalty that came with no cost to them, apart from their absence of political freedom, it appears that they are still operating within the conventional mindset of authoritarian social contract. Their loyalty does not necessarily extend to a preparedness to make sacrifices, and it is largely depend upon the provision of benefits. Russia is therefore at a turning point with a clear clash between the state's expectations of people and people's expectations from the state, with the regime being forced to impose measures that bear the seed of popular discontent, such as a suggested rise of the VAT from 20 to 22% in order to generate an additional 15 billion USD in annual revenue, or in 2018 with the implementation of a very unpopular policy that raised the retirement age. All bets are on regarding the outcome of this tension. Will Russia's economy manage to hold on long enough until a new generation of young Russians more familiar with an ideologically oriented social contract can become Putin's new main supporters and silence the grievances of their parents? Or is Russia rather heading in the near future to the same structural problems Gorbachev had to face in the 1980s? Only time will tell. Thank you very much.
I'm sure Professor Caron is eager to take questions, so you can raise your hand. I think there was much to think about in his talk.
Thank you for the talk. I learned a lot. And I was intrigued when you started to discuss the need to bring in this ideological importance of the Russian civilization. And I got, from what you said, I understood that it hasn't been as effective in the war in Ukraine, even though the propaganda, of course, is that in Ukraine we have this polluted kind of Western Slavic culture, and that, you know, Ukraine was always part of the greater Russia, even though you could sort of flip it the other way if you know something about the
In
history.
the Russian psychology,
Yeah,
Ukraine is part of Russia.
yeah, and I've read some interesting things how that, you know, the Russia was born there, but there's an interesting. Why has that failed in the Russian context, or you're implying that it's not as effective, but it's been effective in some other totalitarian states. And I'm thinking of what happened with National Socialism in Europe, and how that was held onto to the bitter end, among many Germans, while in Russia it doesn't seem to have gotten any deep roots, even though the Orthodox Church contributes to this notion.
And Putin is largely using the Orthodox Church as a political tool to serve his ends. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, I think what really defines an authoritarian regime is the co-optation of people is done through the delivery of the three basic needs that I've mentioned at the beginning of my talk. And the uniqueness of a totalitarian regime is that the legitimacy lies upon the ability to mobilize the people for a specific political, ideological objectives. As I said, I think this is the shift in the past 15 years Putin has tried to achieve, but I don't think he has succeeded. But as you've said, in Nazi Germany or USSR under Lenin and Stalin, or in North Korea, when a state is able to succeed by mobilizing people, then this system basically needs to be crushed in order for this type of mentality to disappear. Because people in these type of regimes, when they will be convinced that their life needs to be at the service of a superior political goal, they will be willing to sacrifice their life. And they will not mind living in poor conditions, not benefiting, not enjoying personal freedom. So I think there's a distinction to be made between political freedom and personal freedom. I think in authoritarian states, it is very important for the authoritarian states to respect people's personal freedom. That's part of the trade-off. But in a totalitarian state, people don't have personal freedom. Everybody's denouncing everybody, people are getting arrested. So when a regime is able to move into that direction, we can say that this regime has become a totalitarian state, which is why some people are saying that over the past 15 years, Russia has become a semi-hybrid type of totalitarian system, meaning that it's trying to move into that direction. And I think my assumption, my guess, is because the typical authoritarian regime, the co-optation of people through the delivery of material benefits, simply is no longer possible. Since 2008, the financial crisis, and even less with the sanctions that have been imposed against Russia since 2022, and these sanctions are not going to disappear tomorrow morning. They will be there for a very, very long time.
Yeah, as you are mostly focused on Putin's social contract, I want to ask if there were any difference in dynamic of this social contract development during Medvedev's term.
That's very strange because Putin as well before 2008, Medvedev was close to the West. He never had this rhetoric of the West is the enemy and we need to revive this Slavophile legacy. It really started at the end of 2011 during the runoff to the presidential election that took place in the spring of 2012. Putin wrote. Two papers were published under his name in a Russian outlet, and this is the first time he was so harsh criticizing the West. Not because, like he did in Munich in 2007, because the international norms were not respected by the West. He really shifted, he started to use this civilizational rhetoric. Like, we are at risk because of the decadence of the West to see our culture be perverted. So that was really a significant shift at the time. But before then, I mean, he always had good relationship, himself and Medvedev. They were turned towards the West. They welcomed Joe Biden when he was vice president to come and give talks at Moscow State University. There wasn't any hatred against the West. Really, the turning point was the end of 2011 and the beginning of 2012.
But it's still the same thing as you said, us versus them as authoritarian.
Yes, the us versus them dichotomy is really a core definition of a totalitarian regime. In all totalitarian regimes in the past, you've always found this dichotomy, and this dichotomy is driving the mobilization of people.
Professor Caron, I actually wanted to ask you about this ideological turn in Putin's approach to social contract, because from my point of view, actually, maybe there was actually no turn at all, because Putin's approach to social contract maybe called ideological, maybe not from the very beginning, but almost from the very beginning, because like we may see that one of main Kremlin's propagandists and ideologists, Vladislav Surkov, formulated his idea of sovereign democracy right after the first Putin's re-elections in 2004. And Kremlin started to organize some ideological youth movements, those neo-komsomols, like the movement Ours, Наши, and going together, идущие вместе, right in the second term of Vladimir Putin. And I actually wanted to ask, maybe Putin has always been more ideological regarding social contract, and it's just changed. Economy of Russia just changed, and it's now just impossible to use some economical incentives for people, and Putin is left only with his ideology, which he was constructing from maybe not his first term, but from his second term exactly.
My point is mainly from the point of the official rhetoric. I think it was in his speech of New Year's Eve's speech of 2000, or maybe even his first speech in 1999, what he said about the West, it was definitely not a discourse of we are opposed to you. Like, we need you, we need to turn ourselves, our economy towards you. And there was really this willingness to work in collaboration with the West upon his arrival to power. I'm not denying that some ideological elements were implemented during his first 2 terms in office, but really, in the official rhetoric, there is clearly a shift, as I said, around 2011, 2012, and ever since, it simply became even more serious. If you read the speeches he's making every year at the Valdai meetings of the Valdai discussion club, it's always pushing the button, always a little bit more. It's always, since 2011 to 2012 especially, it has become like way more serious, this opposition, and he really got closer as well to the Orthodox Church with the Kirill, the reopening of this Orthodox Church just next to the Lubyanka, for instance. So he has multiplied the appearance and the use of Kirill, and his appearance as someone who is, I don't know if it's sincere or not, I cannot make a judgment, but he has been using the image of religion as something that is way more significant in his last 2 terms than in his first 2 terms in office between 2000 and 2008. I think it was about a year ago, he invited journalists to come to his private apartment in the Kremlin, and he was proud to show that he has a private place to pray, and on his table he had portraits of the Tsar, was it Alexander II, the one who was Tsar during the Crimean War.
The one that was assassinated was the second.
No, he did. No, this one wasn't assassinated.
Nicholas the First.
Could be. And this Tsar was like a proponent of the Slavophile mentality in the 19th century. So it seems like he's multiplying the signs that he's close to traditional values and traditional individuals.
Yes, but in that case, how can we understand that before 2011 and 2012, there was actually no pro-Kremlin and in the same time pro-Western organizations organized by Kremlin? Like within Russia, to Russian people, narratives only about sovereignty and maybe in some sense of authority was propagandized. And again, like those powers who tried to anyhow help westernize Russia, like the Union of Right Forces Party, Союз правых сил, the party of Boris Nemtsov and ex-premier Ryzhkov, or Yabloko Party, they actually faced a lot of problems organized by the Kremlin, again, like before 2012.
Yeah, but this is political repression. Like in every authoritarian state, as well as a totalitarian state, there is no political freedom.
Yeah,
So
but-
these opposition parties, it's understandable that they were in a way crushed or minimized. It's typical of it, whether the state is moving towards an ideological shift or not.
But I mean, like, Kremlin didn't try to anyhow organize pro-Western and in the same time pro-Kremlin people among it. It only worked mostly with people who were maybe not 100% critical towards the West, but at least suspicious towards the West. Again, like before these changes after Bolotnaya Square protests. Like,
Maybe the issue between you two is the clear-cut degree of intensity, you know, in the rhetoric, and I believe it's around indeed 2011, something like that, you know, that there is a change. Yeah, before that he wasn't very much in love with Western-oriented politicians. Some of them died, you know, it's okay. Yeah. Can we?
And for my advantage of not being from the field, I can just ask him a question. So, this social contract approach to understanding Putin, you put a lot of some emphasis on the exogenous economic factors, the oil price collapse, and so on and so forth. But there was also a political component, right? I mean, NATO expansion and NATO kind of nibbling away and getting closer and closer. So there's another. I mean, it didn't happen. So it's kind of the West's behavior also impacted his.
It has contributed to fuel his rhetoric, for sure. The color revolutions, it was useful for him to say the West is actively trying to implement its ideology, its culture, its values at the doorstep of Russia.
So it was helping him define this Slavophil kind of approach.
Yeah, I think it fueled that rhetoric. He was able to pinpoint as precise examples. See what they're doing in this country, in Georgia. See what they're doing in Ukraine. They're trying slowly but surely to come with their decadent values and impose them at the doorstep of Russia. And if we don't do anything, it will contaminate the rest of the country. So we need to act, we need to oppose the West because it's an existential threat to us. I think it has really fueled his rhetoric.
I mean, just to go into looking at the back and to go into the future. I mean, National Socialism, Germany, Italy, Spain, they had to last. I mean, in Spain actually, it went into the 70s, right?
Okay.
So this dictatorship, and then Brazil until the 70s. So, is there a post-Putin Russia that we can imagine that is not kind of authoritarian? Can Russia being very big, very kind of unwieldy, kind of lots of, people, very big differences in economic status of the population. Can you imagine democratization of Russia?
I think what happened in the 1990s has left a very sour taste in people's mind about the effectiveness of democracy. People still remember the living conditions, what happened during the transition period, the shock therapy, and they're connecting it not only with political liberalism, but also with democracy. That's just my guess.
And the Italy and the German examples aren't useful to them. That the kind of many countries, the US in particular, came in and kind of rebuilt Europe.
Problem is, if you have a look at the Freedom House, the index of democracy over the past 20 years, democracy is losing ground everywhere in the world. So there's also this idea that authoritarianism is the way, because it is working, it is able to provide people with material benefits and safety, and they're saying, look at the West, there's no economic growth, there's insecurity, people's personal freedom are being violated. So is this the kind of is this the kind of environment you would like to live in? So there is also this thing I think we need to keep in mind. Authoritarianism is on the rise for various reasons. I think the main reason is simply the fact that it appears that the authoritarian model seems to be providing people with the goods, the benefits, economic benefits, material benefits they are expecting. And
Western citizens are living very well.
true, but in the United States, for the first time, that's I'm forgetting the year. I think it's 2024. Not sure. However, a survey was made with people below the age of 35, and only 48% of them said that democracy was a good regime. So, first time in history, you're starting to see a majority of young people who have the feeling that some sort of authoritarianism might be a better way to provide them with whatever needs that they feel they're not able to benefit at the moment. So I think this is something that needs to be part of our assessment of why democracy is, there's an erosion of democratic legitimacy. I think it can be felt, it can be studied with surveys, and just the way people are voting as well. In most of Western countries, the rise of populism, extremist parties, either left-wing or right-wing parties, it has reached a state that is amazingly worrying.
I'm curious if Alexander Dugin and the neo-Eurasianism thought is part of the explanation for the turn in rhetoric that you mentioned in 2011, 2012.
He's probably, outside of Russia, he's probably the most famous political philosopher, but from what I was told, his real influence in Russia is rather insignificant. He's not actually the one who's, he's not Putin's Rasputin. There are other people who have a much more influence on him than Dugin. So, but for sure, I mean, he's fielding this rhetoric that the West is decadent and Russia is a civilization in itself. He has a godly destiny to achieve. But I think Dugin's influence, he has more influence on the minds of people living outside of Russia. He's actually maybe fueling the rhetoric of anti-democratic forces in Europe, especially in Europe rather than just North America, where it's kind of less known than Europe. Yeah.
And then, I mean,
Yeah, go ahead.
I just have a comment when you were talking about the social contract post-Stalin based on benefits of society, and the fact that I think I have it right, in 1967 at the Montreal World's Fair, the Russian pavilion, of course, as all countries do at World's Fair, highlights, all the successes and the benefits, the fact, their space program, but there was also the cultural and the standard of living. And then they took that pavilion to Moscow and they rebuilt it for the benefit of their population. It was sort of symbolic of saying it's not just enough that we're showing this in the world, but here you can see the benefits there. So I found that it's unique in the history of World's Fairs where you what is supposed to be a propaganda tool for the rest of the world is brought home. But
I need to ask my mom. She went to the Expo in Montreal in '67. Maybe she remembers. I'll ask her tomorrow.
I don't know if the building is still there in Moscow. It probably still is.
Yeah, it's still there. This is where they have the F1 Grand Prix every year.
Oh,
on
okay.
this small island.
Yeah.
They've dismantled a bunch of buildings, but most of it is still there.
Yeah. But I'm thinking you're also saying that that some of that ultimately is smoke and mirrors, and the 2008 financial crisis brought that out. So on the one hand, you have authoritarianism in a way expanding and flourishing, and democracy being on its its back legs here. so both have their issues, in terms of, because under this kind of, if you're not able to provide the benefits in both regimes, in an
Yes.
authoritarian democracy,
Both regimes will lose
they're going to
legitimacy.
be unstable.
Mhm.
So it's not very optimistic.
No, but when you have a look at democracies, many people will say because democracies, capitalist democracies are no longer able to provide people with the expected goods. Especially since 2008, economic growth in capitalist democracies, in comparison with China and Russia and the other authoritarian states, it seems like democratic capitalism isn't working, isn't delivering the goods. And it seems like also the problem is, it seems that the people who have benefited from these benefits for the last decades doesn't seem like they want to give up on them. And now, at the expense of the younger generation, who are now realizing, and this is something I've noticed at the beginning, it's not just I have a lot of money and I have a good material life, it's also the expectation, the perception that I'm having a better life than my parents and my kids will have a better life than me. For many people in the Western world, this is no longer the case. Many people now, below the age of 35, are realizing I will never be able to own a house. I will have to rent an apartment for the rest of my life. While they're seeing their parents or grandparents selling their house they've bought for, as we say, the price of a bag of strawberries in 1970, they're selling their houses $500,000. They have a full bulletproof pension fund. Now young people, they're realizing they will never be able to keep their job for 25, 30 years like their parents. If they have a pension fund, they are amazingly lucky, and it's more than likely that they will have to rent an apartment for the rest of their life. So they have this perception that they will not be able to benefit from the system as their parents were able to. And I think this creates a form of frustrations that is transposed in when they're being asked to vote. So all this to say that the authoritarian or democratic social contract, if it's based on the cooptation of people to the delivery of their expected needs, it makes this type of legitimacy very, very shallow and fragile. I think I've been in Kazakhstan for the past 10 years. In January 2022, there was a popular unrest in Kazakhstan, and this led to people dismantling statues of Nazarbayev, who had been their leaders for almost 30 years. And in the course of only a few weeks, you had a denazarbayevification process. His name, so Astana, the capital, was renamed after he resigned Nur-Sultan. It was shifted back to Astana. Statues, monuments of him were dismantled. He lost all his honorific titles, etc., etc. Why? Because the government increased the price of liquefied gas by 15 cents. That was too much for people. And you had this popular revolution, let's call it like that, popular protest, led to a few hundreds of people being killed in the process because the military was ordered to shoot at protesters, and the CSTO forces were also called to come and help the government. But it just showed he had been leader for 30 years, the leader of the nation. I think in the last election, he got elected with 96, 97% of the vote. Kind of give the impression, oh my God, this regime, this guy, his regime, his legitimacy is so solid. People genuinely are in love with him. And they agree that to see monuments of him, that the airport is renamed after him, the university where I'm working is also renamed after him, the city is renamed after him, and there's no protest. So it gives the impression these regimes are amazingly solid, but it's not the case. The moment people will not be able to enjoy their benefits, it can be over in a matter of weeks. I think we've seen it in many other situations. In Tunisia, Ben Ali, who had been there for decades, Mubarak, in Egypt as well, was a matter of weeks. They were overthrown, and that was the end of their reign. Because in these regimes, it all depends on, are you able to provide me with the benefits I am expecting? If it's the case, I'll be in love with you. But if it's not the case, I'll be in the street, and I will not hesitate to overthrow you and replace you with somebody else who will provide me with the expected benefits. So.
But Putin is interesting that, in a way, I guess, I haven't traveled through Russia too much, He doesn't build his own statues. Right? So he's not the Nazarbayev type of.
No.
You know,
Even the case of Nazarbayev, that was in terms of this type of honorific stuff. It was kind of low in comparison with in Turkmenistan, for instance. That's another level of yeah. Well, yes, Lara.
So my problem is with the expression of the social contract. So I think I'm having problem understanding how much does it qualify as a social contract. To use even the definition that you gave to us. Does it really come seen as a social contract? Because what I was missing in the presentation was societal sentiments, how they really internalized the social contract that Putin wanted to enforce. So, because when we talk about Russia, it's very much, again, the same pattern remains of very European Kremlin shaped perceptions and policies, but we sort of forget the entire part of Russia, which is the other side of the Ural Mountains. So, so have you seen or have you observed any difference in notions how this, what you call social contract, is perceived in the European part of Russia and the non-European part
Rural parts of Russia. Yeah.
Russia?
Yeah.
Because I think talking of a country which has 11 time zones and trying to bring them under one denominator and calling them even authoritarian social contract leaves out many components that are easy to grasp even for people who are not living there.
Yeah, I agree. So, first of all, I think the first time the notion of authoritarian social contract was used was in the mid-1970s to talk about Brezhnev's social contract. So I'm not the one who came up with it. But I do agree there is, theoretically speaking, there is a problem because when you think of social contract, it is requiring consent.
Submission, consent.
Yes, but so before submitting yourself to the state authority, you need to vote for these individuals in a free and competitive election, which is why we're understanding democracies as the quintessential example of a social contract, because even if you've lost the election, at least you've had a chance to express your views, your values. You've lost, no big deal, try again 4 years later. So this notion of consent is obviously lacking in authoritarian social states, and same thing in totalitarian states. But as I've said, my definition is more of a business-like type of understanding of the social contract, more closely associated with the typical working contract. So my company, my business is expecting this from me, and in return, I'm expecting this from the company. So if I feel the company is not respecting me, is not paying me in time, deducting money from my salary, I will feel that there is a breach of this social contract, and I will try to find a job elsewhere. So that's my understanding of the social contract. It's more of a business-like approach that doesn't necessarily require consent. So it's really based on a purely rational calculation. Am I getting from this relationship, am I receiving the benefits I am expecting to receive? If it's the case, I'm fine with the relationship. If it's not the case, I will not hesitate to break up the contract and establish another relationship elsewhere. It's true that you have, I think in Russia, my understanding, but you don't have really a lot of studies that have been made, but through documentaries and interviews, it seems that the people at the moment, since 2022, who are the most supportive of Putin might actually be people living in the poor and rural regions, because it is where there's the most massive recruitment of volunteers. And it is in these regions that people are receiving 5, 6, 7 times the monthly wages. And in the case of soldiers dying in Ukraine, their family are receiving enough money that will allow them to build a house. So it's kind of an easy way for the Kremlin to buy people's silence. They will not protest because what they're getting in return, it's sad, their son has died, but what they're getting in return from a material perspective, in a way, it's like winning at the lottery. So I think it contributes to like keep like when you're boiling something, to keep the cover on top of the thing, and also the fact that Russia is so big, 11 time zones. Maybe people in rural regions also don't necessarily have the ability to understand the actual price that Russia has to pay for the war in Ukraine. Because if people in small remote villages that are not connected with other villages, maybe in the past 3 years and a half, they've only witnessed 3 or 4 funerals. They don't have this ability to understand that tens of thousands of Russian men have died because it's not reported. And if the recruitment has been spread out all over the country, again, people don't have this perception. So maybe it also contributes to the fact that there's no anti-war protest, apart from the fact that you know very well if you're going to do it, you will end up in jail.
Just one remark. I think that also needs to be contextualized in the research. It's about the conservative turn in Russian politics, especially Putin's emphasis on conservative values. Even nowadays, we see a surge in Russia of conservative rhetoric. Even people are happy that Netflix is not being able to, people cannot watch Netflix, and all the liberal ideas can be somehow guarded. And you see the financing of state, how the state funds what movies, what shows are funded by the state, which are mostly promoting conservative values. I think that also needs to be tied with this transactional social contract that you are referring to.
But is it sufficient in people's mind to be willing to go and die for the motherland? And that's the point. I don't think it has reached this point where people are that mobilized. Maybe they're fine not being able to watch Netflix or Walt Disney movies for whatever reasons linked with wokeism. That's one thing. But does it extend to the point, in order to fight against wokeism and liberal values, you are willing to sacrifice your life? I don't think the Russian people have reached that point. But I think it is Putin's attempt to mobilize people, the Russian people, up to that point, so he's not going to have to deal with the problems, the inherent problems of the authoritarian social contract.
But could you say that is really gambling? Because I can't imagine any society in the 21st century with internet connections and open access to lots of information buying national rhetoric at that large scale and that convincing scale. I mean, religions is another thing, like we have extreme religious views and all that, but national ideology.
It's a good question. He's definitely gambling from an economic perspective, because the Sovereign Fund 2022 was worth about more than $100 billion, and last time I checked was down to $35 billion. So it's melting like snow at the end of spring. So many people are arguing who will win the war in Ukraine. So basically, will Russia be able to have enough money to finance its war, or will Ukraine run out of soldiers before? Maybe this is the question that we need to ask ourselves. But he's definitely gambling. I mean, the Russian economy hasn't crumbled. Level of economic growth is 3-4%, still higher than any other European country, but it hides a more problematic reality. There's inflation, and at this rate, many people are saying he basically still has 2 years to win his war until he's going to run out of money. He's not going to run out of money. He's going to figure out solutions to raise revenues, but by raising revenues, raising taxes, will it lead to a form of collapse of the social contract? And this is the big unknown. I'm not political science. We're not predicting future.
Just about the idea of a social contract, authoritarianism, there are a couple of studies at least showing that even in China, quite a repressive regime in place, the leadership is highly sensitive to the population's reactions. So whether we call it social contract or understanding, there is an understanding between the population and a particular time of leadership. That okay, we shut up, we accept this, but on the other hand, you have improved our lives in China. We have an apartment. We used to live in a rotten village without restrooms, anything. Now we are here. So there is that understanding, which I believe it exists. And now I would like, my question was, when Putin talks about, not just Putin, the Margarita Simonian and so on, I wouldn't want my daughter to do like these Western girls. You don't know if they are girls, boys, or something else. They have things all over the place in their nose. I mean, yeah. To whom are they talking? I don't think they are talking to the St. Petersburg and Moscow bourgeoisie or upper bourgeoisie. But I think that rhetoric works very well, when you go to the non-Russian nationalities, the peripheries, very traditional people, in particular rural, but also non-Russian. But to return to to the question, have you come across any study, presumably by Levada or others, about the impact of nationalistic rhetoric on the non-Russian, ethnically non-Russian, I mean, groups in Russia? And why am I asking that? Because there are indications, I don't know how serious they are, that these non-Russian groups have been mobilized or have accepted to join the army
Disproportionately.
at a disproportionate rate compared with the Russians, and even more so compared with St. Petersburg or Moscow educated people. Is there any study to indicating whether that Russian nationalism, let's put it that way, works with these people, or it's just the rubles?
I haven't seen any studies. I think it's the rubles, but I think that there would be a price maybe that the government would have to pay if they would have to mobilize members of the bourgeoisie from Moscow and St. Petersburg. So it's just easier to send these people as cannon fodder, and by giving them, I mean, it's not the same amount of money that is being given to people. It's a certain percentage of the average wage in a specific region. So if you're recruiting people from the poorest region in Russia, at the end of the day, it's not going to cost you as much as if you would be recruiting someone from St. Petersburg or Moscow. So there's also this incentive from the part of the state to primarily focus on these people from rural and poor regions, and they will be more susceptible to sign these contracts because they see an opportunity to win at the lottery. Even if they die, at least they have maybe the perception that, well, at least my family will be safe. And the Chinese case is very interesting as well. I haven't really studied the Chinese case, but you will remember how the COVID restrictions were lifted, especially in Shanghai at the end of 2022. You had people who went down the street and they said enough with these restrictions, and you had only a few thousand people who did that, and it was just a matter of days before the government just lifted these very harsh restrictions. So what I would say at that point is that one of the three elements that I've mentioned, but I've focused less on it, is the notion that in an authoritarian state, the preservation of people's personal freedom, not political freedom, but personal freedom, is perceived as something sacred. Like, I agree, I will not have a voice, I will not have a say when elections will come, I'm not enjoying political freedom, I'm fine with this, but In return, I'm expecting to be able to do whatever I want to do in my private sphere. And this liberty has to be as extended as possible. I think that was the triggering point in China. People were fed up with these restrictions on their personal freedom. And so it's kind of paradoxical to say in an authoritarian state, people have a lot of personal freedom. I think you need to have lived in an authoritarian state for a decade to realize how this is actually true. Like in Kazakhstan, during the pandemic, for instance, we had exactly the same restrictions as anywhere else in the Western world. Everything on paper, in theory, was shut down. In reality, it simply wasn't the case. And when I've asked my mother-in-law, who's an old commie, she's a nostalgic, she said directly, there's no way the government will tell me what I can do with my life. If I want to go to this gathering with the family, I will go. And you felt the police officers who were supposed to uphold these rules, they realized they would have taken a chance for their own safety. So you had these rules for 2 years on paper. In reality, nobody was respecting them. And the government did not do anything because that would have been, I think, crossing a red line that people would not have been able to accept.
I think final question maybe, and it's 5:30 already. So please go ahead, sir, if you have a question.
So it may sound like a rookie question, but still, like since we discussed Russian modern ideology so long, I just want to ask to ensure what actually it has within it, except opposing to the West, because ideological talks on propaganda media like Russian TV channels or websites like Russia Today, it changes like from year to year. The only thing that's still the same is the idea that Russia should oppose the West. So previously, Russia believed in communism during Soviet times. Before that, it was like the orthodoxy and the rule of the Tsar. What's now Russian ideology, if not opposing the West?
Well, precisely, maybe it's not working because it's too shallow. Maybe the set of belief is not coherent, explicit enough. As it was the case with Nazism, communism, maybe it's simply not enough. Or there's not a strong enough emphasis on it in the official rhetoric. It's a good question, but at the end of the day, I don't think it has actually worked to mobilize people.
Before thanking Professor Caron for his enlightened talk, just a comment of mine. You know, there is a kind of, understandably, probably, demonization of Russia. Why Russia is not democratic? Why should it be democratic? First question. Why is there is a rule in the universe? Everybody has to be democratic, has to follow what Washington says. Is that the idea? So that's my starting point. Can a country with more than 120 ethnic groups still around there and dozens of ethno-territorial administrative units be democratic? And I can go on, but I don't want to go on. The main thing I want to say is that Putin is being presented as a kind of, suddenly he's a fanatic, anti-Western and so on. He wasn't like that in his early period, I'm afraid, at all. He looked at the reality, the advances of NATO up to Georgia. I think Georgia came just after the talk in Munich, and he drew the conclusion that this has no end. I mean, you know, and then there was a Bucharest summit where the West proudly declared that Ukraine, Georgia have to join NATO. I like to look at things in a contrarian way. Would the US tolerate, let's say, a Canada that is part of the Warsaw Pact?
Or Cuba having nuclear missiles.
Canada that wants to join the Warsaw Pact, let's say in the 1970s or 80s, before it's being dismantled. Or Mexico. I don't think Canada would last too long. It's bad news for you, you know. I wish you well, though, in the Warsaw Pact. You know, it's very simple. When you have a pseudo-foreign minister of Europe, that lunatic, Kaya Kallas, she is on video, literally. She says with her smile, which is quite intriguing actually, she says, wouldn't it be cuter if Russia were cut into pieces, smaller pieces? I mean, the agenda is right on the table. There was a leak a few days ago, actually, that Britain, MI6, and naturally MI6 won't do anything alone, had a plan already starting in the 1970s to cut China into 3-4 pieces. I mean, are these guys supposed to sit and say, yeah, you know, welcome, you know, cut the country as you wish, and so on. So these are my comments just to go against the mainstream of that they are brainwashing us with, and to give some food for thought, you know, and that's it. But I will shut up very soon, so don't be concerned. Tomorrow, at 5 o'clock, the Turpanjan Institute is organizing a book discussion online with very, very good scholars, with participants stretching from Japan to the US. It's a book about, it's entitled Dreams of Emancipation, a Transnational History of the Russian Revolution, of revolutionary Russia, with some very, very good specialists of Russia, including one I know. It's via Zoom. The link appears in the newsroom and probably some email you have received. If you have nothing better to do, join the Zoom. Finally, maybe if I am able to do it, there should be at some point a round table to assess in a dispassionate way the so-called Washington agreements, including the peace treaty, the presumably peace treaty, but I'll see if that can be done. In the meanwhile, we are all very much obliged to Professor Caron for taking the time to give us this talk. And I should add also that his coming to AUA has been a blessing and very useful, which is exactly the goal of the C. Judson King Distinguished Visiting Professorship. Not a person who comes like an in-and-out burger, you know, moves in, moves out for a year, but somebody who really helps develop the place. So I would like to thank him also for that. And thank you all for coming.